This is Garis, masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 559, entitled "The Core Idea of Feminism is Deeply Misandrist." Description. The core idea of feminism, that is, that gender oppression is a one-way street, that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed, is deeply misandrist, given that women oppress men far worse, given that women's big three ways that women oppress men last decades, and hence are far more serious than the rather minor ways that men oppress women. This monoconscious feminism is seen by masculists as hypocritical and bigoted, and is hated. This growing hatred of the masculists towards monoconscious feminism will lead to millions of bitter confrontations between monoconscious feminists and biconscious masculists, until most feminists have been biconscioused. Before that happens, a lot of verbal blood will be spilt between the two groups. Flyer itself. Ad-libbing. I haven't made a masculist video in about a month because I'm recovering from surgery. A week or so back I turned 75. That's my definition of an old man. And the surgery was to have my prostate cut out because it went cancerous. Hopefully with it removed, the cancer is gone, and I may even repeat what my father did, and that is live until 100. So I've still got another quarter of century of life left. Okay, the flyer itself. So I've recovered enough to get enough mental energy back to get back to writing masculist flyers. So here's the first of a new batch. The core idea of feminism is deeply misandrist, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In my view, the core idea of feminism is that gender oppression is a one-way street. That is, that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. This makes men out as the bad guys and women as the innocent victims, which is obviously misandrist, especially given that masculists see the reverse as more accurate. That is, that women are the greater oppressors, since many of women's major gender crimes against men last decades, which makes them far more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. To masculists, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is seen as rather small beer compared to the big three ways that women badly oppress men. That is, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, each of which is so horrific that masculists have a real hatred of women who commit these major gender crimes against men. So when a biconscious masculist is confronted by a monoconscious feminist who hears her sprouting her monoconscious cherry-picked half-truths, then he inevitably feels antagonistic towards her, because due to his biconscious knowledge, he knows that in reality women oppress men far worse, since women's gender crimes are much more hateable than the ways that men oppress women. Sure, a woman who has been raped by a man has every right to hate her rapist. Masculists are not fools. They see that feminists have a case. But what really pisses masculists off is that monoconscious feminists seem incapable of showing the same level of understanding in the reverse direction. Some women can. For example, those who write masculist, that is, female masculist books. But the large majority of feminists are monoconscious and have no idea that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse than vice versa. So that men, that masculists, have every right to express a hatred against those women who commit these horrible gender crimes against men. This monoconscious bias that feminists have is deeply misandrist because it paints a very misleading and negative picture of men that is greatly unfair to men. Biconscious masculists see this, but monoconscious feminists don't, since feminism preaches to women that gender oppression is a one-way street. Feminism says nothing about how women oppress men. Much of feminism is an intellectual projection of women who want to play the victim card, not taking responsibility for their own lives, blaming men for women's problems when women are largely responsible for their own problems. Masculism is much more science-based, whereas feminism is much more wishful thinking-based, preaching to women that they can blame men for their problems rather than have women facing up to the much more difficult task of coming to terms with women's inadequacies and inferiorities that cause so many of women's problems. Masculism will force women to grow up. Masculists are mostly biconscious, so do not have much patience with monoconscious feminists who like to blame men for everything. Masculists tend to be very snappy at such women, haranguing them with masculist ideas and masculist hatred of women's massive gender crimes that women commit against men. Because of this masculist impatience with monoconscious feminists, it seems to me inevitable that over the next decade there are going to be millions of very bitter, verbally violent, hateful confrontations between biconscious masculists and monoconscious feminists as the two groups talk past each other. The monoconscious feminists will respond very negatively to masculist anger and hatred at the monoconscious bigotry of the feminists, and will fly into feminazi rages at the biconscious masculists, who will do the same to them, and with a vengeance, since they are males and hugely more verbally aggressive. So when men turn their full male anger and hatred at monoconscious feminists, these feminists are going to have a real shock. Feminists have had a monopoly over gender politics for the past 6 decades, so are unconsciously accustomed to having the last word when it comes to gender political discourse. So now, to be confronted with biconscious masculists who harangue them viciously with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, will cause them to stop in their tracks thinking, quote, "What the fuck has happened to men? Where has all this ideological and gender political hatred towards women come from?" Question mark. Of course, these monoconscious feminists, being monoconscious, will not understand a word of what the masculists are saying. All these monoconscious feminists will hear is the hatred and anger coming from the masculists, and they will find it very threatening. Women probably evolved to be fearful of men when men became truly angry at women, since such a man in the distant past would have been quite capable of killing the woman who is much weaker than him and who has much lower testosterone levels, making her much less physically violent. To the monoconscious feminist, the real anger and hatred coming from the masculist is just more male misogyny in her eyes. She will not be listening to the content of the masculist arguments, but only to his anger and hatred. She has been taught by feminism to oppose such male misogyny, so will ratchet up her anger at him. To the masculists, the monoconscious bigotry and hypocrisy of the feminist only increases his level of contempt and hatred towards her, knowing what he knows about masculism, that women oppress men worse. and that feminism is deeply hypocritical and bigoted, since it preaches that gender oppression is a one-way street, whereas the masculist knows from his masculinist knowledge that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse. So he will have no patience with the increasing anger of the feminist and ratchet up his anger and hatred of her, resulting in a very bitter, verbally violent confrontation. He will be saying to her, quote, "You women commit far greater gender crimes against men than vice versa. Millions of you are manslavers. You don't bother to fip up getting career competent educations, then expect to manslave a man for decades, living off his money and labour, which makes you truly hated by the masculists. Masculists effectively exterminate women who are manslavers by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, removing their hated, manslaving, fluffy, divorce-raping genes from the gene pool. Manslavery is slavery to masculists and a war issue. Masculists have a burning hatred of women who commit manslavery. Masculists argue that it was men who liberated women by giving women science-based medicine, so that women today have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century. Men gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education, so that masculists now stand up and point the finger at women, saying, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will get you killed." This is the end of part 1.